Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm Stephen Burt from NQA. Thanks very much for taking the time to join me today. So what we're going to look at is the forthcoming new international standard, ISO 14060, the Net Zero Aligned Organization Standard. This is super exciting for me anyway. I find these things to be very exciting, and I can't wait for it to be published. We'll run through quite a lot of detail today. I think it'll probably take around about 45 minutes or thereabouts. If you have any questions, you should be able to see the question icon on your control panel for the software that we're using today. And if you click on that, you can just type in any questions, and we should have around about 15 minutes towards the end to be able to answer those if I can at that point. So feel free to put in the questions as we go, and we'll have a look at them towards the end. So in terms of what we'll do today, a bit of introductions first to myself and obviously to NQA. I'll give a very, very brief overview of NQA's sustainability products and services, and then we'll spend the bulk of the time, as you would expect, looking at the new standard itself, ISO 14060. So it's called Net Zero Aligned Organizations. We'll look at what it is, we'll look at why it's being produced, we'll look at when it will be published, some of the timelines, and we'll look at the how of what do you need to do to be able to conform with the requirements of it. And as I say, we should have about 15 minutes towards the end for any questions and answers. So a quick introduction to NQA first. So we're a global certification and verification body. I look after primarily the verification side of the business. In the orange box in the middle there, you can see some of the sort of sustainability focused ISO standards that we provide our services against. We're a UCAS accredited certification body and a UCAS accredited verification body as well. So we offer greenhouse gas verification services to various ISO standards. We offer PAS 2080 certification services, which is a carbon buildings and infrastructure standard, sustainable events, social responsibility, and also the usual ISO standards that you're probably aware of for quality, environment, health and safety, information security, and energy, and several others as well. So NQA is very much a global organization these days, and my role is to look after the carbon and sustainability services that we provide. So just a quick overview of, the kind of scale of the organization itself. This is slightly out of date, a couple of years out of date. But yeah, we've been around for about 38 years. We've got well over these days 60,000 certificates globally, operating in 100 countries or so, and well over 1,000 employees these days as well. We're part of the Kiwa group of companies. So as I mentioned, I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director at NQA. I've been here for 18 years. All in all, I have sort of 25 years experience in carbon, energy and environmental management. Way back in the day when I did my master's degree in environmental management and technology in 1996, I think it was, I did my master's project on this new pending forthcoming standard called ISO 14001. So that was just published in 1996. And I've never managed to escape ISO standards since. I've been doing it all that time. So even from university, I was doing ISO standards. I'm a chartered environmentalist. Of relevance is my PhD, because it's a net zero related PhD that I'm in the middle of. But I'm also a lead greenhouse gas verifier myself, a lead auditor for some of the sustainability standards. And I'm also a member of the UK committees, SES 11 and SES 17, which develop ISO standards for environmental management and greenhouse gas management respectively. So they have input to the development of new ISO standards. The products and services that we offer at NQA, which fall under the kind of sustainability umbrella, ISO 14064 and 14068 are greenhouse gas verification standards. Through our parent company, we can also offer accredited environmental product declaration verifications, FSC and PEFC are timber chain of custody certifications. RSPOs are Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which we offer via our ASI accreditation. PAS 2080 certification, which is carbon management in buildings and infrastructure standard. And then the other standards, they're net zero aligned, ISO 2121, ISO 26000, 53,000 is pending, new, expected to be published possibly next month, possibly August. We'll see the new United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Management System standard, which is going to be exciting as well for people like me. And the bottom of the list there is the one that we're looking at today. So ISO 14060 net zero aligned organizations. It's not published yet, so we do not currently offer verification against this standard, but as soon as it's published, we certainly will do. And as soon as UCAS are in a position to offer accreditation for us to be able to do that, we'll certainly be applying for that as well. So that's just an overview of the products and services that we provide. So moving on, we'll have a look closely at ISO 14060 first then. So firstly, I'd like to just kind of set the scene, a bit of context, a bit of background to net zero, and then we'll look at what it is, why it's coming along. We'll look at some of the timescales. Today's particularly relevant because today, yesterday actually, the public consultation on ISO 14060 was launched. So we'll discuss that briefly. And then the bulk of the time we'll spend running through the requirements of the draft international standard. So it's not published yet. We only know what's in the draft international standard, but we can have a run through those, which should give you a pretty solid understanding of exactly what's involved and what will be expected. And lastly, as a verification body, you might expect that I've included a section on how ISO 14060 will be verified by verification bodies such as NQA. So a bit of context and background to net zero first. So this is the kind of thing that I like to look at. My background's a scientific background. These are showing data on the right-hand side from NASA. This is carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. On the left-hand side there, we can see in the orange color, these are proxy indirect measurements taken from ice cores from 800,000 years ago, before today. And then the red line, since 1958, there's been accurate monitoring of using modern instruments of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And then the graph on the right shows since 1958, right the way up to April 2026, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see seasonal fluctuations in there as well, but certainly a general trend of increase in growth overall. And the latest measurement that NASA have is from April 2026, which is 431 parts per million as a concentration. And what that's leading to is increases of global average temperature as well. So there's a strong correlation between global average temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So that's led nations to agree as what's called a science-based target. So the overarching goal is to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit that temperature increase to just 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That is what's called the science-based target that ISO 14060 and SBTI focus upon in the challenge against net zero. So why is net zero important? So scientists agree it's the most critical issue facing the planet, climate change. It results in climate change. The UK government was one of the first nations to actually set themselves a statutory target, a commitment to reach net zero by 2050. That's in keeping with the science-based targets, and there's legislation, there's net zero strategies, carbon budget delivery plans which focus on being able to do that. Net zero itself, the little diagram in the top right hand corner there kind of tries to explain what's meant by net zero, but ultimately it means when generate emissions and removed emissions, be that through man-made removals or through natural processes that remove greenhouse gas emissions, when that equals zero, that is a state of net zero. So when we're generating emissions and removing the same amount. So companies, organizations, industry will never be able to get to the point that they're not generating any emissions at all, but there are mechanisms to be able to remove an equivalent amount, and that's ultimately the state of net zero. So this is important because for UK companies and organisations, generally speaking, there's various regulatory and policy changes which drive decarbonisation. That's really to a lesser extent, but to a much greater extent, supply chain pressures and stakeholder expectations are driving it. So we do lots of greenhouse gas verifications here at NQA. The reason that the companies are interested in it primarily is because their customers are asking them to do it, and we'll see more of that coming. And I would anticipate that ISO 14060, the net zero aligned standard we're looking at today, will become over time a kind of expectation, a supply chain expectation for many businesses, a little bit in the way that ISO 9001 quality management system has just become a business as usual standard. So we might be able to see it moving in that direction over the coming years. So all of this results in companies, many companies, making public commitments to net zero. There's very little accountability and very little transparency around how business performs against their own net zero targets overall. But there is one brilliant website, it's called zerotracker.net, which tries its best to hold the world's biggest companies accountable to their net zero progress. So according to Net Zero Tracker, about 2/3 of the annual revenue of the world's largest 2,000 companies is covered by a net zero target. However, only about 1 in 6 of those largest 2,000 companies are currently on track to reach their net zero emissions. 82 of those 2,000 companies are based in the UK, and according to Net Zero Tracker, only 10% have a suitably detailed plan to achieve their target, only 60% have a partially detailed plan, and around about 30% actually have no detailed plan to achieve their net zero target at all. So the accountability and the transparency around this is of critical concern, and obviously ISO 14060 is part of the solution towards that as well. So really, overall, there's a lack of an available mechanism to provide assurance against the company's net zero target, which is credible, robust, transparent. Independent and impartial is an important element for NQA as a verification body. We're accredited to deliver our greenhouse gas verification work by UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service, which requires us to be impartial and objective. It requires us to work to certain standards when we perform verification and certification activities. We are all about ISO standards overall, international standards, and when we undertake the work, it has to be undertaken to ISO competency requirements as well. So let's look next at what exactly is ISO 14060. So as I mentioned, it's net zero aligned organizations. It's pending. It's not available yet other than in draft format. It doesn't exist in isolation. There's a 14,060 series of standards, all related in one way or another to greenhouse gas management. It's aimed at organizations, so it's not for projects, for example, or products, for example. It's organizational level alignment with net zero targets. Its requirements, so there has been a set of guidelines that were produced by ISO previously called IWA 42 Net Zero Guidelines. That was launched back in 2022. Once ISO 14060 is published, it will replace IWA 42, but its requirements, it has got some useful guidance in the back actually, but it sets out requirements for aligning to net zero. it will rely on the ISO 14064-1 standard for the greenhouse gas quantification process. So 14064-1, we offer accredited verification against that. And if a company chooses not to use ISO 14064-1 to quantify their greenhouse gas emissions for ISO 14060 purposes, then they'll be expected to use something equivalent. The greenhouse gas protocol is actually mentioned as that as well. So the method for quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions is key, because that produces the data that we set our science-based targets against. So why is ISO 14060 being produced? In my opinion, ISO, they're a little late to the party for net zero standards. You know, there are other voluntary standards out there for net zero. So ISO have come to the table a little bit late overall. It's all about demonstrating your alignment to net zero to your stakeholders, really, and it gives the option for independent third-party accredited verification to the actual standard itself. And the benefits, obviously, we can think large. I've mentioned competitive advantage. I think it will become a kind of supply chain go-to in time, ISO 14060. So this is about, you know, gaining a competitive advantage. It's about reducing the risks to your business. Policy compliance, there's not so much in the way of regulatory compliance for smaller companies at the minute, but certainly larger companies, there's regulatory requirements around reporting greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we shouldn't forget environmental improvement and long-term business sustainability. So some of the drivers for the standard are detailed there. And then in terms of the timescales, as I mentioned, it's a pending standard. So currently it is at what ISO call the DIS stage. So that stands for Draft International Standard. Yesterday, 17th of June, it was put out for public consultation. So people are able to comment on it now, and those comments will be accounted for when it eventually gets to what's called the FDIS stage. So that's the final draft international standard, and that's the last step before it's published formally. So yeah, currently at the draft international stage. So just be aware that the content of the next few slides that we'll look at are in the draft standard. It will be pretty close, I think, to what it will look like once it's finally published. However, that public consultation process started yesterday, runs, I think, until I want to say the 13th or the 18th of August, because of 12 weeks or thereabouts. And that's the opportunity to have an input into the content of it. And then finally, it's expected to be published in Q1 2027. It's been delayed a lot over the last 2 years because, like all ISO standards, it requires international consensus on the exact wording of the content of the standard. So we expect it will be around Q1 2027. And once it's published, it will then replace the ISO guidelines for net zero, the IWA 42 document. So that'll actually be removed from use and replaced with ISO 14060, which is a requirements document. If any of you are interested in preparing now for ISO 14060, you can take steps at the minute. You know, we offer accredited verification to ISO 14064-1, which will be the standard to use for the greenhouse gas quantification process for the net zero standard. And we also offer a net zero aligned service, which is against the guidelines IWA 42. And the guidelines aren't a million miles away from what the current draft standard actually looks like. So you can do some preparations now. If anybody is interested in perhaps you know, potentially being one of the world's first organizations to be verified against ISO 14060, then more than happy to have a chat about that, and I'm sure NQA would be able to help. So next we'll have a look through the actual requirements of the standard itself. Just to reiterate again, it's in draft format. It's not published yet, so what we're focusing in on here are the requirements within the draft standard, but it's not going to move a million miles. You'll be able to get a good overview of what's in here, or what's going to be in the final version from having a look at this. So it's arranged as all ISO standards around various clauses. Clause 1, 2, and 3 we don't need to worry about for the minute. That's about scope and references and definitions. So the requirements really begin with clause 4. And very similar to all of the ISO greenhouse gas standards, it lays out some high-level principles to think about when preparing for conformity to ISO 14060. So some of the important ones there, that the principle around urgency, to have a high level of ambition, to aim to support the transition towards net zero, climate change adaptation and mitigation. We mentioned science-based targets earlier. It's going to use as a principle the science-based approach to net zero alignment. Conservativeness, so not overestimating anything, always underestimating. That's sorry, not underestimating, always overestimating. Avoiding adverse impacts. So, for example, one company achieving net zero by offshoring its activities could be an example there, and also around the carbon credit side of things, avoiding adverse impacts around deforestation, for example. Credibility, equity and justice. Transparency is key as well, so making information available and transparent. And lastly, the value chain and life cycle approach. So it starts off laying out 11 relatively high level principles that are expected to be accounted for when preparing for ISO 14060. This is important because as greenhouse gas verifiers, so ISO 14064-1, the greenhouse gas quantification standard, it does the same. It starts off with clause 4 principles. They're slightly different from these ones, and there's fewer of them. But we, as greenhouse gas verifiers, these are requirements. So when we raise any findings during our greenhouse gas verification work, we categorize them against these principles, actually, because they're so fundamental to the overall process itself. So clause 4 lays out the principles. Clause 5 at the minute is called the general approach. So what it provides is 5 different sub-clauses. The first one is about the framework for aligning to net zero. The second is about the mitigation hierarchy. So there's a hierarchy which involves, as you would expect, reducing greenhouse gas emissions first, so getting them as low as you possibly can, and then removing what's left over to be able to achieve net zero. And the removal process takes place through investment in removal projects, primarily carbon crediting, that type of thing. Setting out your net zero pathway. There's information on the actual role of carbon credits in the achievement of net zero. And as you would expect with all good ISO standards, there's a clause that describes the documented information requirements and how that needs to be managed and controlled. Clause 6 is about top management, leadership, commitment, roles and responsibilities. So again, this is quite common within ISO standards. There's a clause that lays out, for example, top management's commitment to providing the necessary resources, be that people or be that money, laying out what the responsibilities of different roles within the organization might be, setting that commitment towards aligning to the organization's net zero target. So that all falls under clause 6. When we do greenhouse gas verifications, we almost always try to organise a top management interview with the managing director, for example, or the CEO of an organisation, just to verify that that level of commitment and leadership is real. And then clause 7 is about establishing boundaries. So this is very critical because it's about exactly what we're looking at, the boundary that we draw around the organisation, and also the reporting boundaries. So there'll be an organisational boundary, so exactly which organisation we're looking at, which sites are involved, and there'll be a reporting boundary, which greenhouse gases are involved, what are we actually reporting on, which activities are we reporting on. So clause 7 will be about the boundaries, the organisational boundaries and the reporting boundaries against which the greenhouse gas quantification process takes place. And then clause 8 is actually about the quantification itself. So this will refer us to ISO 14064-1 as the methodology to be used, or an equivalent with justification. If you don't use ISO 14064-1, there'll be a need to justify why not. But it does specifically mention the greenhouse gas protocol as an alternative to ISO 14064-1 for the quantification process, so long as you take the value chain, the life cycle approach, which we saw was one of the principles for clause 4. So it covers some general requirements around quantification. It requires us to produce a base year, because we have to have a starting point to measure ourselves against, and to measure progress each year towards the net zero alignment target. So a base year for companies doing this for the very first time, in other words, quantifying their greenhouse gas emissions, first year is usually their base year. Here at NQA, we've had greenhouse gas verification clients for many years, and some of them might have a base year going back 6, 7, 8 years. NQA itself, I quantify our greenhouse gas emissions every year, and we measure ourselves against a 2019 base year, and each of our annual reports includes our progress against that particular base year. And then the last requirement in clause 8 is around continual improvement of the greenhouse gas quantification. So as time progresses, more accurate information becomes available. For example, in emission factors and conversion factors that are used, more accurate science becomes available as well, which also feed into the same thing. So as time progresses, the greenhouse gas quantification process can be subject to continual improvement. It can be subject to changes, improvements, which need to be accounted for in the quantification process. Clause 9 is about the transition planning. So this is transition to net zero. So it will ask you to develop a transition plan, and it also gives a very useful set of bullet points which describe the content of the transition plan. In other words, what needs to be in there. So when documenting the transition plan, we've got a good source of information about exactly what we should include within it there via clause 9. Clause 10 is about the target and the pathway setting for the greenhouse gas emission reductions. Starts off with some general information, and then it requires us to select a relevant sectoral net zero pathway. So that depends what we do as a business. It depends on the sectoral pathway that's available for us. It also requires a feasibility test for residual emissions. So residual emissions are what's left when we've reduced as far as we possibly can. So if an organisation, for example, for the sake of argument, emits 1,000 tons of CO2e as a result of their operations in 1 year, potentially by the time 2050 comes, if that's what their net zero target is, they may have reduced that to 10 or 20 tons of CO2e and they can't reduce any further. They just can't because of the operations that they do. So that would be the residual emissions, and then those final residual emissions need to be subject to carbon removals to allow us to get to a state of net zero. And then the next clause uses, and this is an interesting change because ISO always resisted the terminology scope 1, 2, and 3. So if you look at ISO 14064, for example, it doesn't mention scope 1, 2, and 3. They've always used the terminology direct greenhouse gas emissions for scope 1, energy indirect greenhouse gas emissions for scope 2, and indirect greenhouse gas emissions for scope 3. So this is a significant change just in terms of terminology, that they're equating the ISO terminology, direct greenhouse gas emissions, with scope 1, the energy indirect with scope 2, and other indirect with scope 3. So you can see from clauses 10.4, 10.5, and 10.6 that there's an expectation that targets are set for scope 1, targets are set for scope 2, and targets are set for scope 3 in terms of reductions overall. So we're looking at a target for each of the different categories there. Clause 10.7 talks about activity-related targets, so we can also, as well as have an absolute targets, we can have intensity-based targets as well, which can be used. And the last element in clause 10 is about the indicators, kind of key performance indicators that need to be monitored and measured to be able to demonstrate that alignment to net zero is taking place. So you can imagine you can download some. There's an Excel tool that you can download. Just if you just type in science-based target, you can download it, and you can put your information into that tool. So you can put in what your scope 1, 2, 3, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are, and you can tell it which date you intend to achieve net zero, and then the tool will apply the science-based targeting, and it will provide you with a nice profile, a pathway towards net zero, for example, and the indicators associated with that pathway are what we're talking about here. And then clause 11 is about net zero action. So it requires, as you would expect, greenhouse gas mitigation action. In other words, how you're going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions on that pathway towards net zero. It has action for scaling low carbon solutions as well, which is a really interesting clause to be in there, actually. So it provides us with the need to provide an overview of what those actions will be, and also taking action for global net zero. So we can't draw a ring around ourselves and think of ourselves as just about the UK. You know, we need to think more widely in our planning in ISO 14060 and a global scale for global net zero. And then clause 12 is about counterbalancing our residual emissions. So if you remember, the residual emissions are those final, impossible to remove or very hard to remove greenhouse gas emissions that after we've done our reductions and reduced as much as we possibly can, as far as we possibly can, what's left is the residual emissions themselves. So clause 12 gives some general information to start with, and then it talks about our requirements around preparing to counterbalance before net zero, and then counterbalancing at organisational net zero. And as I mentioned, once we get to the residual emission stage, we're looking at mechanisms to counterbalance those and also to remove the greenhouse gas emissions, or an equivalent amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So it provides us with information on the quality criteria for carbon dioxide removals. So carbon credits, in other words, carbon removal credits. It dictates what the quality criteria for those will be, so that they're real they actually take place. They're permanent. There's a number of different kind of quality criteria to make sure that they're suitable for ISO 14060 purposes. Clause 13 is about monitoring, improvement and adjustment. So, you know, we need to monitor our progress on the pathway towards net zero. We need to continually improve as well. As I mentioned previously, it's quite a fast moving thing, greenhouse gas emissions and solutions to mitigation as well. So continual improvement is important, and it recognises, and again, this is an interesting element of ISO 14060, it recognises that there may be times when we need to adjust. So it has a clause in there for adjustment as well, to recognise real world changes, real world development, real world activity as well. So the adjustment clause is in there, which is of interest. And then second to last, we have clause 14, which is the reporting clause. So it lays out what needs to be reported in order to be in conformance with ISO 14060. So it gives some general information to start with, and then it looks at the scope of the annual reporting, and note that it is annual reporting, so every year you're expected to produce the necessary reports. It covers reporting on net zero aspiration, reporting on net zero transition planning, reporting to maintain a net zero transition plan claim, reporting on net zero aligned progress, reporting on the actions towards global net zero, reporting on the achievement and the maintenance of net zero status, identifying the limitation of the reports, and ensuring that the reports are credible as well. So there will be a requirement for reporting as it's laid out in clause 14, exactly as there is, you know, for ISO 14064, you need to produce a greenhouse gas report. For ISO 14068, you need to produce a carbon neutrality report. So it's kind of similar in terms of what it's requiring there. And then clause 15 is a validation and verification clause. So we'll come back to that shortly. But as with all of the ISO greenhouse gas requirement standards, there is the validation and verification requirement. So NQA, we're a UCAS accredited verification body. We verify that companies' greenhouse gas quantification and reporting work is undertaken in conformance with the relevant ISO standard. So it's independent verification, it's impartial, it's third-party verification. So clause 15 lays out the requirements around the validation and verification of the claim and of the alignment and of the conformity to ISO 14060 itself. And then last clause, clause 16, covers the claims themselves. So the claims which the organisation makes. So the net zero aspiration claim, net zero transition plan claim, the net zero aligned plan claim, and claims related to the actual achievement of net zero as an organisation as well, and any remedial action that's required around the claims themselves. So yeah, so that covers the requirements of ISO 14060 overall. Just to reiterate again, these are from the draft international standard. It's very likely it will remain identical or certainly very similar to this layout, these clauses, when the final draft is published, and ultimately when the final version is published in around about Q1 2027. So there are appendices in the standard as well. So these aren't requirements as such, but it gives really useful information to help us to interpret and to help us to implement the requirements of the ISO standard itself. So Appendix A provides guidance for small to medium-sized enterprises, small to medium-sized companies. Appendix B gives us useful information around the ambition criteria. Appendix C gives us additional guidance on actions for greenhouse gas mitigation. Appendix D talks about greenhouse gas budget allocation methods within the organisation itself. Appendix E covers the net zero pathways. Remember, we talked the sectoral net zero pathways earlier on, and also locations. Appendix F is about the useful information around the greenhouse gas emission reduction targeting requirement, and Appendix G gives useful information around reduction targets for individual greenhouse gases. So we're not just, although we focus on carbon dioxide equivalents, the actual greenhouse gases, nitrous oxides and methane, carbon dioxide, obviously, sulfur hexafluoride, F gases, and so on, are actually the individual greenhouse gases themselves. So Appendix G gives useful information around the reduction targets for those greenhouse gases. So how will ISO 14060 be verified? So that clause 15, the validation and verification clause, lays out what the requirements are. From my point of view, or rather from NQA's point of view, as a verification body, it's still a little unclear for our purposes of how UCAS will accredit verification bodies like NQA to be able to deliver verifications for ISO 14060. But we've got a good idea. ISO 14064, it makes it clear that we as a verification body must deliver the verification and the validation of greenhouse gas statements in conformance with another standard, 14064-3, that lays out what we must do as a verification body. As a verification body, we need to follow a couple of other standards, ISO 14065 and ISO 17029, and UCAS come and visit us regularly, actually, to audit us against those particular standards. Those are accreditation standards. They're meant for verification bodies like us, not for organizations, not for general businesses. And also there is another standard, ISO 14066, which lays out what the competence of me and my colleagues need to be able to deliver greenhouse gas validation and verification work. So as a verification body, as a UCAS accredited verification body, we need to adhere, all our processes need to adhere to those standards. And it will be similar or identical for delivering ISO 14060 verifications. So whilst UCAS do not yet offer, or they haven't yet been able to offer the accreditation service for this because the standard hasn't been published, of course, when they're ready, NQA will also be ready to become accredited to deliver the verifications for the net zero aligned standard at that point. So yeah, exciting times. I'm really looking forward to the work involved in developing our service around this. I'm looking forward to the accreditation work that will be required to bring us into line with our ability to deliver this as per the accreditation standards that are out there. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of the what's, the whens and the whys around ISO 14060 net zero aligned organizations. Hopefully it's given you an understanding of the likely fundamental principles and requirements and concepts of ISO 14060 as they stand in the draft international standard. It has hopefully given you an overview of some of the drivers towards ISO 14060. Personally, I think primarily it will be supply chain pressures, and personally, I think over time it will become a business as usual standard as well for many businesses, not all, but many businesses. And we've also discussed the timescales as well. So we can expect, or yesterday, public consultation, final draft format, probably Q4 this year, and final publication published version probably Q1 2027. And hopefully I've given an overview of the likely verification requirements that will be involved as well from the perspective of a verification body like NQA. Okay, and we can help in other ways as well. You know, we offer various training services, including for greenhouse gas quantification and including for ISO 14064-1 qualifications and others as well. And obviously the quality, environment, energy, health, safety training and so on. So NQA training run courses regularly, which may be of benefit to you, to your organisation. And if you need any more information, we have our own sustainability microsite. It's full of what I think is interesting and useful information, lots of webinars, which myself and my colleagues do, blogs that we produce, podcasts that we produce. If you need a consultant, perhaps, to help you with any of the ISO standard work that you do, we operate an associate partner program where we can recommend 3 consultants that might be able to help you out. And you can also, you know, contact myself or my colleagues to discuss any of the issues we've discussed today, or around certification and verification services to ISO standards more generally. And there's our contact details in case you wanted to do exactly that. Good, so that brings us to the end. I said we'd be 45 minutes and we've been 46 minutes, so that's a pretty good guess. I'll have a look at the questions now. If anybody's got any questions, put them in the box. So the little question mark box on the control panel that you can see, and I will do my very best to answer them if I can. So I've got a question here from David, just the one question actually at the minute. Is there a distinction between carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases? So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So a greenhouse gas is, there are several of them. Primarily carbon dioxide is one, nitrous oxide is another, methane is another. They're all different kind of potencies in terms of how they create, how they contribute towards global warming. Fluorinated gases as well, the type that you find in air conditioning systems. Sulfur hexafluoride is another one that you might find in electrical equipment. So carbon dioxide itself is a greenhouse gas. What the CO2e refers to, the carbon dioxide equivalent, which is the standard measure, the standard metric that's used, that is basically a conversion of all the different greenhouse gases put together to a carbon dioxide equivalent number. Hopefully that helps and answers the question, David. I don't see any other questions at this stage, so with a bit of luck, I've given you all the information that you need to be able to understand. If any questions do occur to you later on, feel free to get in touch, and I'll be more than happy to answer those as best I can as well. Okay, good. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join me. I hope that's been useful and informative, and wishing you all the best for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.